that we need to, my personal feeling is that one of the ways that we can do that is by building community with those who we are closest to, right? Those who we resonate with. You know, we don't have to go, like some people want to go save the world, right? But they have people right next to them who they could be building community with, right? So I think that one of the ways that we build community is by engaging with those who are right next to us, right? Who are our friends, our co-workers, our family members, right? These are the groups the Universal House of Justice has bid us to engage, right? I'm gonna tell you a little story. Um, as I said, like the theme for today is for me is storytelling, and this is a picture of me when I had just finished doing a year of service in Haifa, Israel, at the Baha'i World Center in about 1994, and I think it was 1995, and I had gone after that through East Africa to visit various communities that you know had embraced the cause of Baha'u'llah at that time, and I was out here in this little village in um, southern Tanzania. It was a village called Ipapa, and the whole village had become Baha'is, and so I went there, and you can see. I went there with a couple of guys who were from Dar es Salaam, you know, the capital of Tanzania, and they were kind of like translating for me. You know, I was like the white man. You know what I mean? Like that. That's how they perceived me when I was out there. And John here. You know, he spoke Swahili, and Jevarange over here, he spoke Swahili. And then the places that we were going to, they didn't really speak Swahili. They were like, you know, they spoke the local languages, right? Um, and so like it was very, very basic kind of living. You know what I'm saying? Like this was out. This was far out. It was like 5 hours from like the nearest city on the bus that we got off the bus, and then we walked for like another 3 hours to get out to this village. And it was I saw one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life when I was out there, which is I remember the first night I got up in the middle of the night and I went outside of one of these structures and I looked up and the whole sky was just filled with stars. I mean, it was like a blanket of light, you know, and I had never ever seen anything like that. It was like the closest that I had ever gotten to the experience of the what they call the sublime, right? Overpowering beauty of nature, right? I had never seen anything like that because we were so far away from any significant life source, you know, so you could see the heavens, if you will, with such clarity. So anyhow, we were out here, and then they wanted to go bring, you know, the message to a neighboring village, which was about 20 minutes, 30 minutes away from there. So we walked out there. And when we walked out to that village, we got to this this kind of like this room where they had a whole gathering of people, and all these people were sort of sitting on the floor, and we were going to begin our session with prayers. And so, you know, me being like the kind of like the guest from outside, you know, they gave me the honor of saying the first prayer, and I said the prayer in English, of course, as I could. And like from the back of the room, like I heard this one person like kind of sneeze, and I was like, all right, so someone's sneezing, you know, so I hope everyone's all right. And then one of the other guys who had come with me from Dar es Salaam, right, he was saying a prayer, and he said it in Swahili. Okay. And so when he said his prayer in Swahili, after that, a couple more people had sneezed, you know? And I said, oh, this is strange. What's going on? Right. And then so after John said his prayer in Swahili, the guy who was, you know, one of the head men from that region, he said his prayer in the local language, and you can imagine what happened, right? The whole room is like sneezing, right, and shaking and like doing this stuff, right? And so this was to me the indication of a kind of spiritual vivification, right? That it was a kind of courtesy for someone in the room to sort of demonstrate, you know, yeah, you got some spirit with you because we don't really understand what you're saying, but we know you're trying to channel the spirit. So we're going to indicate to you, you know, through this kind of expression of spiritual move, of being spiritually moved. And then so as it got closer, right, to the language and the means by which they were familiar with communing with with divinity, it became more powerful for them, you know. So when their man from their area said the prayer, it was most intense. And I say that because I think that for me, when we are engaging in community and we are engaging in the work of racial justice and race unity, one of the things that we can do is begin to engage those who are closest to us, right? Who we have the most resonance with, right? And I think particularly for African Americans, for Black Baha'is, right? It's so crucial, right, that we bring the message of Baha'u'llah, right, to other Black people, right? Because we don't really know what the possibility of the revelation is, right? We're kind of just playing around with it. We think we have an understanding, but it's actually when we bring it to other people that they will demonstrate, right, what is available in this infinite ocean of Baha'u'llah's revelation, right? So it's so what we can do, I think, is develop community with those who we have the capacity to resonate with in a very in a very sort of close way, in a powerful way. And so I think that, but we can't just think that, we can't imagine that that's going to just happen like miraculously again, right? We have to abide by certain kinds of um, community building endeavors, right? And so we develop these new stories of community. And the way that I'm thinking that our stories of community have to change is by a sort of recognition of the difference between our community building, maybe, and some of the expectations around community and sort of social advancement that is resonant with some elements in the society at large. So I'll clarify that in a moment. But of course, one of the ways that we know we can understand the stories of community that we need to develop is by looking to the universal house of justice, which we know is the source of all good, freed from all error, right? So we have to understand that as those who abide in the covenant. I think that the only really the only really valid place for us to look for our instruction to how to undertake this stuff on a day-to-day basis is to the universal house of justice. And we can see some of like the incredible guidance and the efficacy of the word of the universal house of justice, I think, in some of these, most recent messages that it came out like in the beginning of the COVID era, right? And we can remember in like Rizvan message of almost a year ago now, that it's like the universal house of justice said, look, what's happening. Waves of suffering and sorrow are breaking over one place after another, and will weaken different nations at different moments in different ways. And we saw that weakening happen in America, right? I mean, we saw, like, after the murder of George Floyd, like the way in which, like, it was almost as though there was a kind of a snapping, within America, right? And then we saw the weakening of these kinds of social democratic structures that there has been a mythology around for so many years and for so many people, right? We saw it weaken before our eyes, right? And the Universal House of Justice told us that that's going to happen. And one of the things that what we have to do, according to the Universal House of Justice, is to hold up a means of getting through this period that we know is going to be dark, right? The Universal House of Justice has told us that. And I think it's really important to think about what we're doing as society building. This is an interesting thought, that we're actually building new societies, right? There's a mounting realization on the part of the world's people that decades ahead are set to bring with them challenges among the most daunting that the human family has ever had to face. It is against this background of furious storms lashing humanity that the arc of the cause is about to embark upon a series of plans that will carry it into the 3rd century of the Baha'i era and significantly strengthen the Baha'i community's capacity for realizing the society building powers of the faith. So what we're trying to do is build society. And one of the things that we know that we have to do is undertake these lines of action: study circles, junior youth groups, children's classes, devotional gatherings. And we know that there has to be like a very almost mechanical approach to it. And some of us resist that mechanization. We're like, no, 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 no. I don't want to be in a framework. I want to be spiritual, you know. I just want to sort of be spontaneous and improvisational, right? But the fact of the matter is that one of the primary things that we're up against in the U.S., right, are very systematic forms of social oppression that take that manifest themselves in anti-blackness and white supremacy, right? These are systematized kinds of problems that we have to overcome. And so we would be kidding ourselves if we think that we are going to overcome them without a system of our own, right? And so the Universal House of Justice, it continually sort of begs us to get into these modes of systematic work that are all centered around the word of God, but which emphasize developing a framework, being systematized about it, patterning, right? And always learning, always engaging in learning. And we have to do that. And I think in the context of developing spiritual capacity at large, right? So I know that this particular gathering is about uprooting racism, right? This is what we have been charged with. Like we know that as American Baha'is, like our first thought has to be on how we're going to uproot racism, right? How we're going to supplant this evil scourge, right? But we can't, I think, also delude ourselves into believing that it is something that happens like through just laser-like focus on one thing. I think, this is again just my personal opinion, that we have to develop an ensemble of spiritual capacities, right, which then give us the power, the means, the strength, the spiritual fortitude to actually uproot racism, right? It is not something that we can think about apart from the rest of our spiritual lives. Because, right, to overcome racism is like, it's not just about this interpersonal, like I love you, you love me, right? And so we're good. We have dinner together. That's important. I'm not trying to underplay that. But when you think about the systematized way in which racism impacts our society, you can see that it's going to require more than just altruism and friendship, right? It's going to require some fundamental sacrifices, right? That can only be shouldered if we have developed I think, a very robust sort of spiritual reality, spiritual lives, and spiritual vision. So we can think about it in terms of like housing insecurity, right? Which is one of the ways in which we see systematic racism, unfolding, right? And I'll just take the example. I've used this example in California, right? That there's about 6.5% of Californians are Black. It's a small percentage of Black people in California, right? But those Black people represent 40% of the homeless people in California. And y'all who are not from out here, you probably know, right, how crazy the homelessness is, in the area that I'm in Los Angeles. You can just go, just yesterday, I'm in LA, you see encampments, you see like little cities of homeless people, right? In one of the most affluent cities in the entire world, you see these little like villages of homeless people. 40% of those would probably be Black, maybe even a higher percentage in LA, right? And that's, and although it's quite pronounced here in California, it holds true of the U.S. as well, right? So one way that we can begin to undo some of this systematized racism as it manifests in housing insecurity is to have socially subsidized housing, right? And one way that you can, and I'm not sort of an advocate of this particular measure. I'm saying this is one measure that people have offered for dealing with housing insecurity, right? You can have these socially subsidized housing. One of the things that's easy to do is to have housing that is built within more affluent communities, right? Because affluent communities have things like educational access already. They have good medical care, and they have less interaction with the police state, So why not put socially subsidized housing in those kinds of communities, right? That would be what some advocates say a good way to deal with some of the housing insecurity that we have, and that has this disproportionate effect on Black people in the U.S. We put them in affluent communities. Now, there's a lot of people out there who say, I'm not, racist. In fact, I'm anti-racist, right? But if you say we're going to build some low or middle income housing in your affluent neighborhood, time after time after time after time, we see that that is something that is rejected, right? Because people in affluent communities are going to say, my property value is going to fall. I worked hard for this investment. I'll have to sacrifice, and when it comes down to that material sacrifice, we see that it's very difficult to do, and it's very unlikely that people are going to be able to do that unless they have both a vision of the need for racial justice and a well-developed spiritual vision, right? Something that tells them that sacrifice is in fact a bounty, right? That our duty is to safeguard the interests of the poor in our midst, right? So, and we can go to the hidden words and see all the principles that we need to develop as Baha'is, that would give us this capacity to really do the sacrificial engagement that we need to have to really sort of change social structures that could have a powerful impact in terms of supplanting and uprooting racism. I'm not going to go through all these right here, but like sometimes people ask me, so what do you think should be done, to achieve racial unity in America? That was like the theme of like one talk that people asked me to give, and I said, I said that we have to do this right here, which is each soul must consider where the good pleasure of God resideth, and what conduct, manners, and words will draw him nigh unto his Lord, right? That's for each soul. That's for each one of us to contemplate and think about, right? The means by which we can accomplish it, right, are given to us in that we need to develop a pattern of community life that is characterized by accompaniment, right? There's no leadership. There's no there's not that we don't have individual initiative, but we don't have these ideas of leadership and so forth that would separate out one from the other. And because I'm a little bit short on time here, I want to I want to tell this one story so that we can understand, I think, the efficacy of something like the study circle method, right? These are stuffed grape leaves. My wife, Narmin, she grew up in like a small village in Jordan. And this was one of the kinds of meals that the women in her, little town would often prepare. And whenever she's making it, she always remarks about the way that it takes so long to prepare these stuffed grape leaves, right? Because each leaf has to be picked from the tree, right? And then after it's picked from the tree and prepared in whatever way it has to be prepared, then you cook the rice, and then you cook the meat, and then you put all that inside each individual grape leaf, and then you roll it up like a cigar, right? And you make your little tiny, grape leaf. And then imagine you're cooking for a family of 10 or a collective of 20, where families will come together to share this meal. You're cooking for days, in order to have a meal that's only going to last 15 minutes, right? But there is a kind of, I think, social genius, right, in the community building, right, which we see in that meal preparation, right? So in that meal preparation, the most important thing actually is not the meal itself, right, but is the bonds of community that are created between the women who are preparing the meal, right? The opportunity for sharing and for loving one another in that process, right? And so actually eating the food is only a small part of the entire endeavor. What's actually most important, right, is the process of collective endeavor, which builds bonds of community, which hold societies together. And I think that as Baha'is, when we're involved in something like the study circle process, this is what we have to understand, that the study circle is not just a means of getting through a kind of book, right? It's not studying a book so that we get through it and we get on to the next book, right? Inherent in that process is community building, right? We use the study circle to draw closer to one another, right? To develop these bonds of loving friendship, which are really the foundation, right, of society. So when we think about ourselves as being involved in a society building process, and we see these tools which have been prescribed to us by the Universal House of Justice, we have to understand that it is in the way in which we engage in them that we're able to develop bonds of friendship and unity and love across boundaries, right, which so often divide American community, along race. And so as we do this kind of work, we have to always think that, what we are meant to do is accompany one another, right? We're not meant to lead anyone. We're meant to accompany one another as we walk along a path of service, right? We don't aspire to individualistic ways of engagement. We're aspiring to collectivist ways of engagement, right? And we're not involved in a us and them kind of narrative, a story. We're involved in a story that is about the requirements of unity. And that's a very difficult thing to do given the history that we have in this nation, right? And we have to think creatively and sacrificially about how we can accomplish that. But when we do, right, we begin to create these bonds, right, of unity in the context of the study circle, these new forms of community. We have to develop new stories about how we're going to develop communities based on principles of accompaniment, collectivism, and unity. And as we do, we build more and more and more of these study circles, right? And these bonds, and we begin to transform the society in which we find ourselves, right? And it's in the context of those kinds of bonds that we begin to, the Universal House of Justice has told us in a letter, right, written to someone who's deeply concerned about the issue of racism in America, right? It's in those contexts, right, that we start to identify specific concerns like the race issue, right? And we figure out how we're going to explore the problem together and participate in this process of learning about how to resolve it and eschewing the inclination towards withdrawing, right? And becoming in conflict with one another. I'll end by telling a story about Abdul Baha, as Liz bid us to at the beginning, right? To call to mind in this centenary year of the passing of Abdul Baha, his example. And comes from about, I think it's October of 1912. Abdul Baha had already been in Chicago when he was on his second trip through there. And when he was on his arrival at the platform on the train, throngs had come to see him because they were sort of aware of his magnetism. They had been involved with his speaking beforehand, and many people were attracted. There were so many people on this train station that there was hardly any room for anyone to see Abdul Baha, particularly for someone who's quite short and small of stature. There's no way that they were going to be able to see him. And so one man who we know of, usually by his appellation Fujita, Saichiro Fujita, was a Japanese Baha'i who had come to America, and he decided to climb up onto a light post, right, so that he could get a better view of Abdul Baha. He had become a Baha'i back in Oakland, in the west of the United States, over here on my side in California, in the early part of the 20th century, and was excited to see Abdul Baha. He'd missed him on his first trip through the Midwest, and Saichiro Fujita was in the Cleveland, Chicago area at that time. And when he went up on the light post, Abdul Baha said to him, "Come down, Zacchaeus, come down," right? And when he did that, what Abdul Baha was doing is channeling that story of Jesus Christ when he traveled through the city of Jericho, and there was a taxman, right? A taxman in the city of Jericho who was also short of stature, who had gone up in a tree to see Jesus as he passed through the town. And when Jesus saw him, he said, "Come," his name was Zacchaeus. He said, "Come down, come down." And so what was very interesting about that story is that, because of his position as a taxman in Jericho, this was a despised figure. And yet Christ said to him, "I must stay with you tonight." So Christ goes to the home of Zacchaeus and stays with him. And this was perplexing to the people of Jericho. And we can imagine that the same thing was true of the close relationship that Abdu'l-Baha formed with Fujita, right? Because he said to him, you know, Fujita, you need to come with me as I go westward, right? And as he went westward, he took Saichiro Fujita with him. And it was quite an interesting sort of companionship that they had. And it was unlikely, right? And of course, in that time, Japanese were subjected to anti-Asian discrimination. And so there was one time when they were in Colorado, again at another hotel. The proprietor of the hotel had set up a dinner table for 5 people, and there were 6 people in Abdu'l-Baha's group, including Fujita. The proprietor of the hotel said, you know, we only set up a table for 5 because we assumed that this Japanese man was your servant, right? And Abdu'l-Baha said, no, we are one. And he put Fujita at the center, at the right hand of his own setting there with the table. But what's also very interesting to me is that he took Fujita westward, right? Back into what was likely the teeth of anti-Asian sentiment in America at that time, right? And I think that we might imagine what Abdu'l-Baha was demonstrating to the Baha'i community and to the community at large when he did that, when he brought one of one of his close companions as an Asian person back into the west of America. When he got there to San Francisco, he also paid a visit to Charles Tinsley. Charles Tinsley had become a Baha'i in probably in connection to Robert Turner. He also served for some time as a butler in the Hearst household. And in the time that Abdu'l-Baha had gotten to San Francisco, where he had recently been struck by a car and was confined to his home. He couldn't attend the gatherings that were planned for Abdu'l-Baha, was quite upset about this. And so when Abdu'l-Baha found out about that, he came and paid him a special visit, right? He came to his home, and Abdu'l-Baha asked him how he's doing. And Charles Tinsley said, you know, it's been rough. I've been laid up here in the house, pretty depressed actually, because not only just because of the pain I'm in, but also because, you know, I haven't been able to engage in these activities that I knew you were going to be at. And Abdu'l-Baha told him a story. He said that one time there was this king, I'm returning to the king, right? And he had one of his favorite people in the kingdom thrown in jail, right? And then he had him bastinado, he had him tortured, right? While he was in the prison. And then after he had been tortured while he was in the prison, he took him and then he hung him almost to the point of death. And then he released him. And the man said to the king, I don't understand what's going on here. You know, I thought you loved me so dearly. And the king said to him, you know, I have in mind for you one of the most important stations in my entire kingdom. And I wanted you to be prepared for it. I wanted you to be strengthened and tested. And so now that you have endured all that, I know that you are fully prepared for this position that I've given to you. And so Abdu'l-Baha told Charles Tinsley that story. And he said, you know, God sometimes causes us to suffer much and have many misfortunes that we may become strong in his cause. And you will soon recover and be spiritually stronger than before. And I think it's telling that not only did he share that with Charles Tinsley, who had endured this accident, right, but also with a Black man, right, who had been through so much, you know, and was of a people who had endured so much and have grown to have such capacity, right, and such strength and will and determination. And I think that although there's a great moral to be understood in this story for Black people, I think the same holds true for all of us who are deeply engaged in this work of racial unity and supplanting the evil of racism, right? In that we know that we're going to suffer and it's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult to endure. And in fact, we might be confirmed when we experience that. We might know that it's a special station that we are aspiring to when we experience those difficulties. And so I'll just end with that and say thank you so much for engaging the work that you do, and for building community together. And I just look forward to being in serried lines with all of you as we try to build this kingdom.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I don't think I'd be lying if I said I was mind blown by a lot of the presentation and the way you weaved in and out of different concepts and brought the community building process at the forefront of everything that we do for the purposes of racial justice. And so thank you. And if it's okay,
thank you.
If it's okay, we can open it up for questions for a little bit. How much time do you have for questions?
I've talked for a long time, so I don't want to bore people anymore. I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to talk. But
okay,
you don't have to listen to me also.
All right. So if you have any questions, if you know where your how to raise your hand, please do. And I'll also keep an eye out for your hand if you can't. Kathy Lee, I see your hand up.
Actually, I just want to make a comment. I thought this presentation was at such an in-depth level. It was far deeper than the kinds of discourses that I've participated in before. So I just want to express appreciation for both the intellectual but the spiritual depth of your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you so much for saying that. I'm very grateful that you felt that way. These are, I feel like they're deeply entwined, the spiritual sort of element of our work and this kind of sociological, historical piece of it as well.
I see Nima's hand.
Thank you, Derik. I'm curious about any thoughts or initial thoughts you have about the role of oppressed groups, Black folks, women, the poor, but particularly Black folks and women, in terms of the accompaniment aspect of the healing process and the building of a world based on, the principles of our faith, truly. Because, a lot of people are like, will say, well, I suffered this much, so I don't want to suffer anymore to explain to you and help you. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or if you've had conversations before about that, what insights you have about that kind of dynamic.
Thanks, Nima. I feel like, all of us, regardless of who we are, right? We are meant to be engaged in a twofold moral process, right? One in which involves transformation of the inner self, right? And the other which involves transformation of the society around us. And that as we engage in those, they have a reciprocal effect upon one another, right? This is what the Guardian tells us. And so that for me, to the degree that it is possible, we try to engage in this work. And that when we engage in this work, we are simultaneously involved in a kind of spiritual refining and spiritual aspiring, right? That may give us the strength that we need to endure things that we thought not possible to endure, right? I don't prescribe for anybody but myself my own kind of engagement. You know what I mean? Like, I feel as though this is the beauty of the maturity of the Baha'i Faith, right? There is no person who stands in judgment and tells one person what to do and another person what not to do, right? This is left to the individual. And I feel like, as I said, that is a signaling, right, of the degree of maturity which is required, to build the kingdom that we are trying to build, right? It's that this is a relationship between the individual and God. We know the principles, we know the lofty standard, and then how we live that out is left to each of us, right? So, like I can only say that the guidance is there for us, and then we each do our best to engage in it as powerfully as we can, and we refrain from holding anyone else in judgment. That's how I see it.
Thank you. Chuck?
Liz, thank you so much, Derik. That was really powerful. I'll be thinking about it for a long time. I have lots of notes, and one of the things you started out with was talking about how we think of the future. And I recently found a document from UNESCO that talks about transforming the future, and it talks about how we're colonized by history. We're colonized by the past, that we kind of think, or we get stuck in these patterns and think this is the only way that it could be. And I think I so appreciate you talking about Baha'u'llah has really come to tell us and help us tell a new story, to write a new narrative of who we are as human beings. And I think particularly as a white man, and the struggle, the crisis of whiteness that we're going through now, and the story that needs to be told for people of European descent as we move away from whiteness and white supremacy, there needs to be a new story told about our identity. And it hasn't been done yet. There's a lot of work yet to do. But I think about that because I don't think whiteness can be redeemed. I think it's really, we need to move to something new, a new narrative. And so it really made me think a lot about that, and not to be colonized by our history. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those insights. And I do believe, I think that when we kind of are able to develop these new stories about history, and we're able to recognize that there is a way of looking at the past which is so out of step with the one that we are bid to inherit, then we begin to be able to develop these new ideas about what's possible in the future. I think that to a degree that we are not, it's almost incapable of us recognizing we are enslaved to conceptions of reality that are created by history, by a history that we're not even fully aware of, and that we can break free of those chains when we sort of ask these fundamental questions about, things like whiteness and blackness and so forth, so, and okay, so let me just say, give another example of like how we could think about whiteness, in a like a different way, right? And we understand it to be a constructed category, right? We have to remember when this category comes into coherence, right? It's in a period where Europe is like at war with itself, right? For hundreds of years, European nations, up until the Treaty of Westphalia in like the mid 17th century, Protestant, Catholic, fiefdom after fiefdom, they're all at war with one another. And then lo and behold, there's this new world over here, and there's this kind of discovery, oh, wait a minute, we don't really have to fight against one another. We could start going over there, right? And getting all that territory and reaping the benefits of the exploitation of that territory. But we have to develop some way of unifying ourselves, right? So ironically, whiteness can be seen as this unifying mechanism for Europeans in their project to colonize other parts of the world, right? And so then you get this story, and it's nothing but a story, right? About like the kind of the bonds of whiteness between, European civilizations and so forth, right? And that then allows a kind of pivoting away from Europe, the internal problems, into this colonization of the rest of the world.
Thank you. Charles, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Derik. I just wondered if you could share any, I know we're all talking, we can only speak personally, but can you share anything that you have found useful? I mean, being a Black man in addressing the urgency of where we are right now. I mean, like each day we have to get up and live, we have to be exposed to everything that's around us, we have to look at it from many different aspects, and then we have to try to be productive. I mean, you have any tips, anything that you found that's helpful for us as Black people to do that?
Well, my feeling is, and thanks for all the work that you do, Charles. I mean, I know the efforts that you are making in this precisely this path, and so again, I'll just speak from my own experience, as you said. That's the only thing that we can do, is I think that like it's being in that humble posture of learning, right? That learning mode as we engage with others who are attempting to bring on their vision of justice, right? Because there's so many people who have a vision of justice, which I think resonates with our own, and I feel that the more I engage with people who are sincerely and like wholly committed to that, like the more that I learn, about like how those ways of thought, the degree of commitment, the strategies of engagement that these other people make use of can be applied to the work that I'm trying to do as a Baha'i, and so I'm pretty enmeshed in other kinds of sort of social justice movements, social justice initiatives, particularly around prison issues and the criminal justice system and this kind of stuff. And I see like some of the passion and the ideals of people who are doing radical work, like incredible work in those areas. And that I feel kind of inspired by and empowered by. And I just take heart from that. And then, I've had like opportunities to do this bridging then. I find that there are those who are like-minded in those organizations who are now, I kind of like involve them in usually a more spiritualized kind of way of thinking about things than they have, right? So, like I have people, I'm doing a study circle with people like this, you know what I mean? And it's fascinating because they bring such wisdom and depth and understanding to these ideas of spiritual reality. I'm talking about book 1, Life of the Spirit, and it opens up my thinking, so I don't know, I don't want to go on too long here, but you see what I'm saying? I feel like there's a value and a benefit in engaging with like-minded people. And I think particularly as Baha'is working with Black people, like I think that we have to somehow really tap into the Black church. I feel like somehow we have to make that step. Like, how are we going to engage Black people in their spiritual context, which is, oftentimes really powerful within the church. And that this seems to me like still an untapped resource and something that we haven't fully explored yet. That's one thing that I think we need to do.
Thank you.
Glenn?
Yes. Well, first I want to thank you very much for this beautiful and inspiring talk that you gave. You just mentioned your involvement with like-minded workers for justice in our society, and which is inspiring to me. And I'm wondering if you, as a Baha'i, if you have any insights into the Baha'i model, or what you which I think is evolving. You know, it's our understanding is evolving. But what to be? How are we to be champions of justice when so many of our models for people who have been champions of justice have been adversarial models?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this is such an interesting question, right? Because as you say, like, you know, like the models for social advancement are based on this sort of antagonisms, conflict, and contention, right? The only way to overcome power is by confronting power, right? This goes back to, you know, Frederick Douglass, right? You know, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? You have to confront it. And I think that, you know, it really requires us to do a couple things. Again, this is just my thinking here. One is you know, engaging. You know, it's one thing to sort of step back and say, oh, you're doing it the wrong way, you know, like don't do that adversarial, confrontational kind of thing. And then there's another, which involves sort of engaging with people who are like that, and then finding the points of unity. This is a Universal House of Justice telling us to do. How do we find the points of unity, particularly with people who are working toward justice? And in some ways, you know, there's like what we might think of as a distribution of labor, right? You know, like we have a certain kind of community building labor that we're doing, and it doesn't look exactly the same as the other people, right? And what we have to always keep in mind is that we're not trying to replicate what they're doing. What they're doing, it may have value. It may have, we don't know in this process of disintegration and integration. I think that it's hard for us to tell exactly what is integrative and what is disintegrative, right? And so, but we know that there are these processes going on, and we know the model that we have to aspire to, which is, as you've put it, non-adversarial, right? Eschews conflict and contention, right? And is also really attentive to the relationship between means and ends, right? So that the ends we are trying to achieve, right, have to be achieved through means which are really actually going to allow us to get there. You know what I'm saying? So there's one model that says, you know, make some omelets, you got to break some eggs, right? That's not the Baha'i model, right? The Baha'i model is that we have to struggle as much as we can to build a unified community using unifying means, right? And in some ways, there's models out there of that, you know, which are something like called prefigurative politics, right? Where we prefigure the world that we want to see right now. We don't go into conflict with other people to create the you know, the world that we want to see. We refer back to something that Dr. King once said, you know, the ends are pre-existent in the means, right? And so we have to develop ways of prefiguring this world that we want to see in the immediate. And that's not, I'm not trying to say I have the answers or like, this is how you do it, X, Y, and Z. But I think that has to be borne in mind as we set out on these endeavors. So I don't know if that's such a great answer, but you know, that's what my thinking on that.
Thank you. That is great. Thank
you. Janae, I see your hand up.
Yes, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Dr. Smith, I so appreciate your thinking and the way you approach this. Two things came to mind for me. One, you mentioned the Black church. And what I'm finding and what I've thought about is that the social justice work that the Black churches usually are engaged in, because they're connected to the community, is like the best way for us to really connect up and get involved. And even in my own community, not just the Black church, I live in a community that's predominantly white, but recently, as part of Lent, they set up this thing called the Way of the Migrant. And because we're in a desert kind of environment and we're close to the border, it was dealing with the migrants coming across the border in the desert And so they did it connecting to the Stations of the Cross.
Mm.
And I thought that was a very powerful way of getting people to relate to the struggle and what that meant for migrants coming across the border. And the station, they had a story and pictures that really got you engaged. And then they had you leaving food containers that they could use. So I think that, there's a definite connection there to be explored. The other, you mentioned about housing in California. One of my past jobs was working with Housing Commission, providing affordable housing. And this was in the early 80s in San Diego. And what was fascinating was we were trying to do what we called scattered site building in more affluent areas. And the pushback, just as you said, was very much there. But one of the things I did find as a challenge, while those communities offered a lot, for folks who did not have resources, it was very challenging in terms of transportation and having access to the social services that was needed. And so, while we could offset one issue in terms of providing shelter, it was a challenge getting the services in place. So as we come up with these models, we always have to think of the counterbalancing that has to happen. Again, I appreciate your comments and the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for that, Janae. And I think that, like, you bring up this excellent point, and this is why I was a little bit sort of hesitant to sort of offer, like, as you technically termed, like, the scattered housing model as the solution, right? Is that, yeah, okay, there's these good things about being in an affluent community, but if you're not affluent, living in an affluent community can be difficult in and of itself, right? And then you could connect that to the church, right? So the Black church is often, has been a pillar of sustenance for people, when they're trying to look for somewhere to turn for assistance, right? And oftentimes in those more affluent communities, you're not going to find a Black church, right? So it's kind of like we have to be so holistic and, again, humble in our posture of learning, as we try to advance this work. It's not, we can't have a kind of triumphalist or, savior mentality whatsoever. I think we have to do more listening than anything else, probably.
There's a question in the chat that I can read to you if you'd like. Along these lines, it says, Elga is asking, how do we build these bridges when people just don't want to mix? How can our government's laws and legislations accelerate this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a challenge, right? Is that it seems that people don't necessarily want to do the work, of sacrifice and of commitment that's necessary. But, right, like we are, as I see it, like we are casting seeds, like this is what Abdul Baha tells us, what Baha'u'llah tells us, this is, Jesus Christ says, right? You cast the seeds, some of them grow, right? But many of them don't, right? There's only, like there may be only a small number of people who are really inspired to engage in this kind of work. But it's our job, I think, to kind of like figure out who they are. We can't just say, well, they're not there, so we throw up our hands, right? The challenge is like, okay, didn't work with that person, didn't work with the third person, didn't work with the fifth person, but maybe that seventh person is engaged, does want to do this. And, it's like, I feel like it's like doing that broadcasting, that kind of like being open and being not disheartened, like when our efforts seem to not reap the harvest that we think they should. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it seems to me that we just have to, we continue, and that ultimately, there are going to be people. The people are out there, right? but it's a matter of connecting with them. And that's why I think it's important to get involved in these like-minded organizations, because there you do see, you're overwhelmed. Like, people are like, wow, I mean, like, I'm always surprised by the depth of sacrifice that people are willing to go through in some of these other organizations. This just blows me away, you know? So I think that that can be helpful, you know, to sort of engage with what we see as like-minded organizations and, you know, making incremental efforts there.
There was one question. I know Nari had her hand up. I don't know if she's available to ask her question. Nari, are you?
Hi, Professor Smith. Thank you so much again for your wonderful comments and insights. I just had a question. The Baha'is Exploring Social Justice Facebook group talks a lot about like decolonizing the institute process. And I didn't know what that meant to you, if anything, and sort of, because we're all steeped in this systemic racism and colonization process, how do we ensure that doesn't accidentally influence or permeate our community building efforts that we are called to engage in?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And I think that the first thing, again, this is my perspective. You know, other people can have their own perspective. You know, like, I'm not trying to, you know, like, impose whatsoever my thinking. I just put this out there as a kind of, you know, let's say, creative provocation, right? So my thinking is that first you have to be involved, right? You have to try. You know what I'm saying? Like, and you have to be humble, and you have to adopt the learning mode, right? I mean, these are just the straight up prescriptions that are given to us by the Universal House of Justice. That's most important. And then there does have to be this recognition that we are infected, right, by the corrosive power, right, of racism, right? That we can't pretend that that's not there. And so that when things get challenging and difficult, we have to go back to the admonitions of Shoghi Effendi and Abdul Baha, who told us the degree of commitment that is necessary, right? I can't remember the exact quotation, but you know, Shoghi Effendi says, where race is concerned, right, we must have 100 times more care, you know? And so, like, it's we have to be accepting of the fact that we are working in this sea of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and that if we're aware of that as we engage in these processes, then it's likely that we are going to kind of act in this decolonizing way, you know. And I think it's also, for me, not for everyone, right? You know, I'm fully familiar with sort of decolonizing rhetoric and this kind of stuff, right? But I think it's important to use the language of the Universal House of Justice, right? That, you know, because sometimes when we get into this idea of like, what do we do when we're decolonizing, you know, we can be overly invested in methodologies which are being used by those other justice-minded movements that are out there, which are valuable and important, right? But which we're just different from, you know, that's our deal. Like, we're different in our approach to things than they are. So yes, we're decolonizing, but like, we're using a different language, right? We're using the language of encouragement, right? We are using the language of courage, right? We're using the language of empowering. You know, like we're you know, like the Universal House of Justice gives us the terminology that we are meant to apply to our endeavors. And so, like, I didn't read the quotation there, but like, there's this whole passage about how happy the Universal House of Justice is about the way in which the word accompaniment is beginning to filter into the syntax, the dialogue of Baha'i communities, right? And so one of the things that I think that we can do is, on the one hand, be fully aware of and deferential to the methods of other organizations as they use them, right? But also, like, recognizing that there's a little bit of a difference in our path, right? And that it's pretty critical that we pay attention to our path while doing that, for lack of a better term, you know, decolonizing kind of endeavor that these other organizations are engaged in.
Thank you. Are there any last minute or final questions? I know we've gone over quite a bit, and I just want to be mindful of Dr. Smith's time. So if there are any other questions?
It's nice to be here in like a Zoom room with a lot of people who are fasting. We fast together, like we're sustaining one another in this period. Thanks for thanks for being patient with me and like you know, having a few hours, I guess at this point, of your morning taken up by my talking here.
I just want to say, I think on behalf of everybody, we so appreciate your time and your knowledge and expertise. And we definitely, at least I see the spirit with which, the divine assistance and spirit with which your work is infused. And it's really appreciative and inspiring. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you for doing this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks,
And I'll
Liz.
see you all soon, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yes.
In real life and like face to face, right? It's coming.
Yeah.
It's coming.
Thanks so much, Derik.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Nice job.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful Sunday. Hopefully you enjoy the
Aloha
weather.
pa.
Hello.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Aloha
Liz,
pa.
very much. Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Hey, Glenn.
Thank you.
Hey, Janae.
See you.